Today, most people know Amex for its variety of charge and credit cards, and don't have much of a notion of the businesses that once made up the majority of the company's revenues. The innovation shown over time has allowed Amex to stick around for 170 years while transforming itself entirely every so often. American Express was founded in 1850 as just that, an express company. A sort of hybrid shipping system between the bulk freight carrying of the railroads and the mail delivery of the U.S. Postal Service. The company partnered with the railroads in order to ensure speedy delivery, but also built its reputation for assuming responsibility for anything that went wrong with a shipment. Among their earliest and most important clients were banks, for whom they quickly delivered various financial instruments when there was no central bank to facilitate exchange. The founders of the company were Henry Wells, William George Fargo, and John Butterfield. Wells and Butterfield each operated their own express companies within New York State, with Fargo working as an agent for Wells' company. For a while, they were competitors who constantly undermined one another until eventually a truce was called and the men came together to form the American Express Company. I should say that a truce was called from when they operated separate companies because these guys had some ridiculous beefs with one another, even as Amex started doing massive amounts of business, which they did, as Peter Grossman notes in his book on American Express. Quote, "The key to profits was not a happy workforce or even happy customers, but exclusive contracts and monopoly control of routes. The names of Wells and Fargo should ring a bell for anyone who's done banking in the United States. And yes, they are the founders of the modern financial behemoth." What was the reason that Wells Fargo got started? Basically, because of the constant bickering within Amex. William Fargo had suggested they extend their express line to California. John Butterfield saw this as an affront to his power within the company, and so maneuvered the board members to kill this idea, even though he knew it'd make plenty of money. As such, Wells and Fargo decided to start their own company separate from Amex to handle California. They still also stayed with American Express. Butterfield would even play this to his advantage. Once, while Henry Wells was in California for 3 months, Butterfield came up with a plan to sell more stock. This was under the guise of raising capital to battle the company's competition in the express industry. Really, it became a way to infuse more cash into Amex so that Butterfield could pay himself a 15% dividend from the profits. Generally, Henry Wells had the job of playing mediator between Butterfield and Fargo, also stopping each from having free rein over American Express. With Butterfield, it was usually about paying himself more money. William Fargo wanted control. A lot of the power games subsided by around 1862. As Grossman writes, quote, "Butterfield, Fargo, and Wells still did not like each other, but they were too busy counting money to show it." End quote. Not only did the internal struggles subside, American Express and the other express companies that it competed with began to come to understand one another, either through buyouts or by dividing up territory and agreeing to no longer compete. All three men would be dead by 1881, with Fargo holding on the longest and finally gaining control of American Express. After William's death, it would be his brother J.C. Fargo who would take over and see the company's first transition into a new phase of business. The two important business successes under the leadership of J.C. Fargo were the introduction of the money order and traveler's check. This was a much-needed transition as the days of the express business were numbered. For one, the express business was finally being scrutinized under antitrust legislation after flying under the radar for years. Secondly, the U.S. Postal Service had expanded its role in deliveries. Thirdly, there was just less of a need for many of its services. The express business, as constituted, had peaked. By 1918, and after J.C. Fargo's death, the express business had been spun off into a separate entity, and American Express became much more of a financial business. This turned out to be a wonderful thing, as the business of money orders and traveler's checks would dwarf what the brand had been making as an express carrier. Starting with the money order, you had an ever-increasing population in the United States, and very few people had checking accounts. There was a very real need to be able to send funds across the country, pay bills, and for the immigrant population to send money back to Europe. This was all very difficult to do with cash, hence the money order. The money order was introduced in 1882, and by the end of the century, it had grown to be a $3.5 million per year business for Amex. That's just in sales. There also became the idea of the float. American Express figured out that it constantly had funds from uncashed money orders sitting on its books for a period of time. This so-called float was money that could be further invested by the company into interest-bearing assets, thus making even more revenue from the money order business. Additionally, as sales of the money order grew, so did the size of the float. Another aspect of the money order business that the brand only later realized was due to the use of money orders by immigrants to send money back to the old country. American Express found itself building relationships with financial institutions overseas, which would allow it to later expand globally. The second major product and service breakthrough for Amex came about in 1890 with the introduction of the traveler's check. This would be a massive moneymaker for the company for over 100 years. The traveler's check came about after a trip that J.C. Fargo took to Europe. Back then, when traveling, people often used letters of credit, which may or may not be accepted by banks in Europe. While you could generally receive your money in the larger capital cities, smaller towns were quite difficult to get a hold of any cash in. Even when a European bank honored the letter of credit, it was mostly inconvenient to use. First, the long wait times. Second, the exchange rates could vary wildly. J.C. Fargo couldn't stand this. After all, he felt disrespected that he, as a leader of a major financial institution, had to wait to access funds. This led him to push for the creation of the traveler's check. These issuances were often denominated in $10, $20, $50, $100 increments, amounts that a traveler would usually spend on individual purchases. American Express slowly added more layers of security, such as the initial double signature system. Also, they guaranteed payment and became insanely reliable for standing by their word. They got European banks, hotels, and other businesses to accept the traveler's check, which helped to give the product a large amount of acceptance. From their end, it made sense for these businesses to accept traveler's checks because the demand was so great that it brought them more customers. As Peter Grossman writes in his book on Amex, quote, "American travelers were spending nearly $250 million abroad by the turn of the century, and Americans living in Europe were spending almost that much again." End quote. The money order was a big business, but the traveler's check was a unique invention by American Express and would become a massive success. Travel by Americans to overseas destinations was an ever-growing trend, especially when faster transportation methods came about, from the steamliner right into the jet age. Like the money order, the traveler's check also made the company money with the float. The difference being, the float was much larger and stable than the money order business. People would often hold on to traveler's checks for years, as there was no expiration date, and many simply never cashed checks that they had already paid for. All of these excess funds became a source of further investment and revenue for Amex. From 1900 to 1909, traveler's check sales went from $6.4 million to $23 million. I'm going to skip ahead in the story to the introduction of the American Express card. But first, I want to give a brief synopsis of the intervening years. In many ways, Amex became a rather stodgy old company. One thing it had going for it was its near monopoly on the traveler's check business. During this time, it had gotten in and out of banking, almost got bought out entirely, had been in various foreign exchange businesses, and became a one-stop travel business. The two most important developments during this time for the modern company was the travel business and the continued worldwide expansion. They opened up offices all over the place and became a nearly ubiquitous resource for the American traveler. The American Express Charge Card came about under the leadership of Ralph Reed, mainly because three other top executives in the company had been constantly pushing him to do so. In fact, as early as 1946, the idea of a charge card for businessmen had been floated. Reed was always seemingly receptive, but never entirely went through with any proposal. Some, including Reed, felt that Diners Club was already too dominant in the market to be able to compete with them, which is funny to hear today, knowing how things transpired. However, with the success of the Diners Club card, it became clear that Amex had to jump into the game at some point in time. The question was how to go about doing it. Should they develop their own card? Or should they buy out Diners Club? The latter was initially considered, and a potential deal got deep into discussions twice, but nothing ever came of it. At last, Reed gave the go-ahead for Amex to develop their own version of the charge card in 1958. It really didn't go as planned at first, as Grossman writes, quote, Amex was totally unprepared for this business and was unable to learn from the experiences of Diners Club and the other card companies. American Express suffered from a belief that this was a simple business over which the venerable American Express would easily triumph. End quote. What did go right was the interest from the public in Amex's acquisition of customers before launch. They struck a deal to take over for the American Hotel Association's branded card, thus gaining access to established hotels and restaurants which would accept the new card, plus 150,000 cardholders. They also bought a list of customers from the owners of the gourmet card, which added an additional 40,000 people to the rolls. By the time of launch, Amex had 250,000 customers ready to go. Unfortunately, from the card's test launch in late 1958 to 1962, the American Express card lost the company somewhere around $14 million. It was seemingly such a money pit. New CEO Howard Clark was in the process of getting rid of the card entirely. There were so many delinquent accounts, not enough checking of creditworthiness, membership fees weren't high enough, and customers who needed to be schooled on the idea of paying each month instead of 90 days or longer down the road. Howard Clark decided against getting rid of the card, giving it one more chance. He went outside of the company to hire a man named George Waters, who, while having no experience in the credit industry, turned out to be exactly who was needed to right the ship. Waters saw the explosive growth of the American Express card, which was compounding at 25% each year since launch. He figured correctly that if order was brought to the Amex card division, they would be turning a profit, and eventually a large one. Waters overhauled everything, from accounting to credit checks to purging the membership lists of all of the customers who had been taking advantage of the previous year's disorganization at Amex. He was massively successful at this, and by 1967, there were 2 million cardholders spending over $1 billion per year and producing a $6.5 million profit. The year earlier, Waters brought to market the American Express Gold card, which was more exclusive and featured a line of bank credit. The success of the card business was remarkable and drove tremendous growth at the company for decades thereafter, and arguably until this day. Actually, the success was at times a negative for the company. How so? Well, there were long periods during the 1960s and through the 1980s where they seemed unsure of their identity, always trying to chase some new business opportunity, whether or not it fit well with the structure of Amex. For instance, they had been involved in an inventory leasing business for decades. Despite the fact it didn't bring in much money, it eventually came to bite American Express hard in what would become known as the salad oil scandal, and almost bankrupted the company even with the card's massive boost to earnings. Essentially, a massive fraud in which a company took out huge loans from banks because they claimed to have a large inventory of oil used for salad dressing, which they didn't really. The inventory supposedly certified and backed by the American Express name. When the scheme fell apart, a whole lot of financial institutions came knocking at Amex's door demanding their money. It cost them tens of millions to settle things. Beyond that, during the 1970s and 80s, American Express tried to buy or did purchase several businesses in order to become a conglomerate business, instead of focusing on what they did well. They got involved in stockbroking and investment banking, tried to buy McGraw-Hill Publishing, which was another major embarrassment for management, made overtures towards Disney, Warner Communications, and an ill-fated merger with the business of private banker Edmund Safra. This expansion was known around the company as the fourth leg, as the book House of Cards notes, quote, "For years, Amex executives had been preaching about the need for another income stream besides the card, traveler's checks, and insurance. Not only would a new business enhance Amex's bottom line, it would also protect the company during rough times by diversifying its earnings." End quote. Much of the time between the 1980s and today was spent unwinding businesses such as the investment banking segment and becoming a leaner and more focused entity. The two significant events that I do want to mention are the introduction of the Platinum Card in 1984 and the Centurion Card in 1999. also known as the Black Card. Each was designed to target the company's higher-end clients and offer more benefits than the standard green or gold card had. Today, while it does compete with both Visa and MasterCard, the business is structured more along the lines of Discover Financial. Mainly in that, Amex and Discover both issue cards, lend money, run banking segments, and operate their own closed-loop payment networks. While Visa and MasterCard are more technology companies that own and operate payment network infrastructure, which credit and debit card issuers run on.